While renewable energy was not in as much focus this year as it has been in the past two in the Union Budget of India, it still offered interesting incentives that are worth discussing. In this video, I'll break down what those incentives are and how they might impact the growth of renewable energy in India and more broadly the trajectory of sustainability in the coming few years. If you're new to this channel, welcome. This is Parth, and welcome to What's Next, a place where we discuss the ins and outs of sustainability and our transition towards a cleaner world. Let's get started. First, a small recap of the overall aim of the budget. This year's budget had four main priorities. These are in no particular order. First, unemployment, so tackling unemployment. Second is the upskilling of workers in the workforce. In other words, you might think of this as training. Third, micro, small, and medium enterprises. And fourth, broadly, the middle class. So looking at the middle class and how we can improve their financial condition. All of these look pertinent in the context of where the Indian economy is right now. Of course, the election showed that there was growing unhappiness in the country, which is something that the government is aiming to tackle through this budget. But also, we've had figures that state that unemployment has been growing recently and the income inequality has also been growing. So the budget is actually focusing on these particular financial factors. And so this focus is actually termed under the umbrella term of Viksit Bharat, which essentially means in English, advanced Bharat. And this particular term could actually be linked to the idea of a developed India. And I put the word developed in quotations because the definition for developed actually comes from multilateral banks like the World Bank. So we are trying to align in terms of our growth with the factors and the stages that they've set in terms of what is counted as a developing versus a developed economy. Now, to achieve the goal of Viksit Bharat, they've got 9 priorities in place. And the sixth priority in these 9 priorities is that of energy security, which is what most closely aligns with the idea of sustainability and the energy transition. And it is this priority that we'll be covering in this video and talking about the different tax incentives as well as other packages that might be available for the growth of renewable energy under this particular category. Now, I'll cover these incentives in 4 broad categories, which I've categorized myself, and these should be presented to you on the screen right now. So please feel free to move around the video and cover those areas that you find most useful and interesting. Let's get started. Now, the first category that has seen a very large investment, relatively speaking, has been incentives that are linked to large-scale projects which will focus on the energy transition. To those not aware of what the energy transition is, it is essentially just the shift to cleaner fuels. So moving away from things like oil and coal to produce electricity and power our industries to using solar and wind, which are not releasing emissions into our environment. Now, the budget has announced that they will release a policy which will be focusing on the Indian energy transition by establishing pathways, is what they've called, which could actually get us to a greener place. Now, of course, we've got our net zero targets, and so I suspect that these pathways will actually be linked to achieving those targets and the kind of subsidies and other incentives that might be provided to incentivize the shift to greener technologies and greener fuel. Details to what those pathways look like were not immediately provided in the document, the Union Budget of India document, but I will be covering this as and when they become available. But the Union Budget of India gave some other interesting insights into what they think are the most important parts of the energy transition, and they have actually provided some more concrete incentives for these technologies. So the first one is nuclear energy. From the Union Budget, it sounds like India will push for the research and the development of nuclear energy in India, and that will largely be done by developing Bharat Small Reactors, or BSR, which is essentially just small modular reactors, which are miniature versions of your large-scale nuclear plants. Think of it like Chernobyl. So just a smaller version of Chernobyl. And this does not surprise me. Small modular reactors are being developed across the world because they are less hazardous and are in general more efficient because of their small size. So I am happy to see that India is also focusing its investment into this particular space. The second focus area within this larger headline of incentives for large-scale projects is going to be on pumped storage. Well, what is pumped storage? So pumped storage is a electricity generation technology which is used more as a form of energy storage. Think of it like a battery. Pumped storage has two water tanks or reservoirs situated at two different heights. And so charging the pumped storage would actually mean pushing water up to that higher altitude or height where water can be stored. So when water is required, when we want to discharge or draw electricity from that technology, water just simply flows down through a turbine which produces electricity. And so India will focus on developing pumped storage technology or actually enhancing it or enhancing whatever exists because this is needed as a form of managing renewable generation. Because renewable generation is something that cannot be controlled, and so when wind is not producing, then you could actually store the production of wind through the pump storage technology, and then it can be used when humans need it, instead of actually having to be subject to when the wind blows or the sun shines. And lastly, in terms of generation technologies, we've also got a focus on coal plants, which is interesting because it might sound like it's counterintuitive to the idea of an energy transition, but at least what it sounds like, they're focusing on the development of efficient coal plants, which actually use less coal and are able to produce more electricity, so thereby reducing the amount of emissions that are released into the environment per unit of electricity produced. And while this may not be the most clean form of electricity production, it certainly is a step forward by removing the inefficiencies that exist in thermal plant power generation. So the particular technology that India will be pushing is called Advanced Ultra Supercritical Technology, or AUSC. And without getting into too much detail, the idea behind this technology is to have a higher pressure and temperature to the steam that is used to turn the turbines. And the higher the temperature and pressure, the more efficient the process is, and therefore your emissions are likely to reduce. So AUSC versus your historic technologies like subcritical, which used to be used before the 2000s, is actually going to be much more efficient and therefore technically reduce emissions. Now, beyond just electricity generation, which was the focus so far in our video, the budget also provided a view into other industries such as the steel or the iron industry. And so these industries will actually also get a roadmap where there will be a focus on how to reduce emissions in these industries because it's very difficult, and this is the reason why they're called hard to abate, or which essentially means that their emissions cannot be easily pushed to zero, unlike the power sector where you could actually technically use wind and solar energy. And so these industries will get a roadmap, first of all. That is one of the things that the Union Budget of India said. But also, smaller industries like the brass and ceramic, the government will actually work with these industries and with these enterprises within these industries to find a way to reduce their emissions. And whether that be using cleaner fuels, so using wind farms and solar panels, but also just trying to understand where there might be an inefficiency in the process, which could be removed and therefore your emissions could be reduced. And so, alongside working together with these enterprises, the government will also provide financial support to actually allow for that transition for these enterprises. So that brings us to the end of the first section, which is the incentives that are available for larger scale technologies and industries. Coming on to incentives which are available for consumers. So there was one main incentive that has been provided through the Union Budget of India for 2024, and that is the PM Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana, which will incentivize the addition and deployment of solar panels on houses across India. And so this PM Surya Ghar Yojana, for short, was actually announced earlier this year around February to March of 2024 with an initial investment of 75,000 crore. And as a part of this, around 1 crore houses or 10 million houses are expected to benefit. Okay, moving on to the third section of this video, which are the taxation benefits that are available as a part of the Union Budget of India. Now, there are two main taxation reductions, if I could call it, which will incentivize the development of renewable energy in India. And that is more towards the idea of manufacturing, the cost of manufacturing solar panels. So the first comes at a very early stage of the manufacturing cycle of the solar panel, and that will be on the minerals that are required to manufacture these panels and these wind farms. And so the critical minerals that are required will actually see lesser taxes. And this should theoretically make solar panels and wind farms cheaper to produce. And this, I think, comes as a direct competition to other manufacturing hubs such as China, which are able to manufacture these solar panels and wind farms very cheaply. So it looks like India is trying to compete on that front, which I think is a great idea, especially given the fact that we have similar manpower and workforces. And the second is very well complementing this first tax change, and that will be that the list of tax exempt materials that are used for the manufacture of solar panels will actually be increased. And so many other materials that are used for manufacturing will actually see a reduced tax from 7.5% to 0%. So essentially tax exempt. However, the fact that the tax exempt resources are being increased, there's actually a little bit of change to the solar glass and the tinned copper interconnections which are used in solar panels, which were previously tax exempt and now won't be. So think of this as a little bit of a change in the composition of what's tax exempt and what's not for the manufacture of solar panels. And this comes, at least for the finance minister stated, that this comes because the solar glass production is actually quite abundant in India, so it does not need to be incentivized anymore. And coming to our last portion, which I would term as miscellaneous, which actually only has one particular benefit, which is that India will be developing a taxonomy for climate finance. Now, this taxonomy sounds really complex, but it's not. The idea is to just develop a guideline document that could recognize what sectors and what areas are good for sustainable investments. And the idea is to use this document to spur investment through banks as well as other investors in these areas. So it's just a way of getting some cash inflow into the Indian economy, which is also aligned with the idea of sustainable development and the energy transition. So you might think of this as not much of a material investment from a union budget perspective, but rather a initial building block to something that could lead to investments. And with that, this wraps up our coverage of the Union Budget of India. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you found it useful. If you did, then I would really appreciate a like and a subscribe. It will help a small channel like myself grow. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.